Hello, Nick.
Hi, Leila. We're back again. It's great to see you.
Yeah, you
So
too.
I just wanted to have a little fireside chat with you about the
Okay.
lettings market in general around Manchester, how you're seeing things. And
Mhm.
also I've got a few kind of Q&A questions for you about just
Yeah.
tenancy issues that I keep seeing, questions and so on. But can we start with the high level situation in Manchester? What, and for context, I'm seeing the market get incredibly hot in certain places. So Salford, Swinton, Stockport, those kind of places.
Yes.
Very aggressive cash offers being placed on properties. If with my clients, with their mortgage financed overseas foreign national limited company mortgages,
Mhm.
they're not really competing, and we're having to look further out. So the likes of Middleton,
Yeah.
Radcliffe, Lee,
Yeah.
possibly
Yeah.
Warrington, and so on.
Mm.
And we're closing deals out there. We're also looking very well. We're doing quite a lot of stuff in Doncaster, which is working really well for us. But I know
Yeah.
that's outside of your catchment. So that's
Mm.
the context on the sales side. What's happening on the letting side?
I think it's along a very similar track, actually. The properties that we're seeing huge levels of interest are in those hotspots that you talked about. Uh, Stockport, we haven't had many in Stockport very recently, but when we do get them, they're very popular. But we're getting more and more in Salford, and they just go mad. You know, as long as it's within to be honest, wherever you are in Salford, unless it's known to be a bad area, then it's just incredibly popular because it's so easy to get into the city. You know, there's the hospital there, Media City, where the BBC is based, the Trafford Centre and Trafford Park. I mean, Eccles and most parts of Salford are incredibly busy in lettings, yeah.
And what kind of people are renting in Salford? Is it like middle class Londoners that are coming into Manchester, for example, or who?
I think that depends on the type of property you're offering. If you're looking at sort of a really well presented super modern apartment, then you're going to get the high flyers who work in Media City. But mostly, if you're looking at sort of a two-bed terrace, then that's where you're probably going to get your nurses, your doctors, you know, students applying. We don't like to deal with students if we can help it. But generally, yeah, professionals with good paying jobs.
And uh, is so based on the data that I see, there's a lot of rental price growth in Manchester. Do you think it's sustainable?
I don't know how much longer it can go on. I mean, just at the moment, the lettings market is still incredibly hot, but we've seen over the last couple of weeks the sales market start to quieten down. So how that's going to affect the lettings market, we don't know yet. I can't see it having a negative impact anytime soon. Uh, but yeah, there's definitely a change in the sales market. So I guess it remains to be seen.
And what about other areas of Manchester? So say the less prime stuff, less prime areas, Middleton and the like.
Middleton's not so bad because it's still quite accessible. You can, you know, easily jump on the motorway. It's easy to get around. One area that's less popular, I've noticed, is Lee, just because it's a little bit isolated. It's a much more tedious route into the city centres, and just even to get onto the M60, it's quite a trek. So the places that let the best are the ones that are very easily accessible onto the general motorway links, the M60 in particular.
That's interesting. So you're saying that in these outlying areas, yeah, it is it based. So you're saying it's driving accessibility, let's say. So
Yeah.
motorway accessibility basically is the
Yeah, it's
big one, is it?
not just, well, it's a massive one. Yeah, it's a very big one.
I mean, obviously, it's public transport as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got to look at, if you're thinking of buying in certain areas, there are certain things that you should be looking at. Bus routes, not just, if you can't assume everybody drives to work. So if it's easy to jump on a bus and be in the city within, you know, even half an hour, then that's great. Even better if there are tram links. You know, if you're close to a tram, then it will be a very popular letting property.
So going back to the high level story you're seeing, then
Mm-hmm.
it's what in term it so it's a hot market, obviously on the sales side. Same on the rental side, obviously.
Yeah.
What are the big gotchas that landlords are falling in? What big kind of traps are you seeing with landlords at the moment? Like, is it compromised property or just not paying attention to details with legislation?
No, well, most landlords, if they're buying for the first time, particularly overseas landlords, they're not all that familiar with the processes and how to be compliant and all the different things that you have to consider. But that's where a good estate agent comes in. You know, that's why most of them need a managing agent. The pitfalls, I suppose, there's been a bit of a frenzy in the market recently. So many overseas buyers just looking for any opportunity. And because there's so much competition, we're finding a lot of people paying what I would say is too much money for property. And if the sales market is going to turn, then they'll very soon regret it. But if it's a long-term rental prospect for them, then I suppose it's not such a concern. But a lot of landlords competing for properties that need a hell of a lot of work, and that's when they really start shelling out the money, because it felt like a very popular property because so many other people were bidding on it, but then ultimately it's not necessarily the best prospect, because you're going to be throwing money after money into it to make it a good letting prospect.
So this takes me neatly into another topic, which is what is the relationship between quality of property and quality of tenant?
It's a direct relationship.
Really?
The lettings market is so busy that you're going to get applicants for virtually any property, and they'll be across a really wide range. So you're going to have your DSS applicants, people who aren't working, claiming benefits, would pay rent with universal credit. And most agents will, depending on the landlord, I suppose, but some agents will be quite happy to deal with those types of tenants. But I don't want to sound prejudiced, because obviously you can't tire everybody with the same brush, but generally with DSS tenants can often lead to problems. So we're an agent that tries to avoid that altogether. And we have to be very careful how we deal with it, because there are regulations. You can't discriminate when it comes to advertising a property against people who are not working. So it's how you handle those calls that come in. And what we've been saying recently is, okay, so you're on benefits, the landlord isn't opposed to that, but what they want to do on the first day of viewings is focus on professionals only. If the property remains available after that first day of viewings, we'll come back to you and book you in. But we know that the property will be let, so we'll never go back to them. But you've got to be very careful how you word these things. And then, if it's a property that's really nicely presented in a good location, then you will get those undesirable tenant inquiries, but you'll also get a good range of, maybe a professional couple who have a joint income of, say, 50,000, but then you'll also get people who just blitz all the competition by earning 100,000 a year and by being able to offer 12 months up front. So,
So I'll give you a scenario then, if I may. On the sales side, or the purchase side, which is what I work on, it's relatively easy to find a property that is backing onto a railway, for example, or very near a motorway. And arguably, you said yourself, if you're close to the motorway, that's great. So let's say property is 50 meters from a motorway. And let's say somebody goes and buys the property that's backing onto the railway 50 meters from the motorway, or nearly directly under a pylon. How does that affect the rentability of the property?
It doesn't have as much of an impact on the rentability of a property as it would the resale of a property. So I myself would steer clear of those kind of properties, because you never know at what point you're going to want to sell the property on, and it will become a sticking point, no doubt about it, when it comes to resale. But tenants, they're not looking at the very long term, so they're less concerned with things like that. So it shouldn't obstruct you too much on getting a good tenant.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess where I'm going with this is the qualities of a property that attract the most safe tenant possible, assuming we've got a huge economic turmoil coming along for many years to come, lots of inflation, lots of job losses, all of that bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And what I always go on about is find the property that robust tenant who's economically robust will continue working, continue paying their rent, will enable you to increase rents in line with inflation, all that good stuff. What does that property look like? So you said earlier, good location, nice property. What's a good location? What's a nice property look like?
A good location. Well, we talked about accessibility to the motorway and to transport links. Also, it depends on what type of property you're going for. If it's an apartment, then you're focusing on a certain type of tenant. They're going to be mostly young people without children. If you're buying on a bigger scale, a family home, then you also need to factor in things like nearby schools, and just let's say you're buying on an avenue, that's going to be a nice sort of an overall attractive prospect as a place to live for a higher end tenant with a family.
So do you think, should one think of a property like, if I was an owner occupier and this was a desirable property, then a tenant would find it desirable too? Or is there a gap between the owner occupier and the tenant in what they actually want?
Well, the type of property, the reason you buy a property is because it meets your requirements. So if you've got a family and your children are of a certain age, you need them to go to good schools, then everything you're looking for when you buy a property, if you're going to live in it, is everything the best kind of tenant is looking for.
Right. Very good. Okay. I want to move on to a few questions that keep resurfacing when with clients and so on. So the first one is gas hobs. They're quite dangerous, especially if you leave them on and
I've never had an accident with a gas hob.
You've never had an accident. Well done.
I don't know anyone else.
Okay, so no one's blown up a house because they left the gas on overnight. So what's your general view on gas hobs, for example?
If it's an integrated appliance, so usually you'll get an electric oven with a gas hob that's built into the work surface and an extractor hood above. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. No safety concerns. As long as it's fairly new, and even if it's older, if it's well maintained, it's not too rusty and covered in rubbish, then it's what I find more tenants prefer a gas hob than an electric hob. And I, for one, agree. That's how I feel.
Okay,
Honestly, I just moved into a house, Nick. I just bought it, and they don't have a gas supply to where the cooker goes. And I've never. I think I've had an electric hob once before, and I was used to a gas hob, and I was apprehensive about moving into a house where I had no choice but to have an electric hob. I mean, it's okay, but I'd still swap it for a gas hob in an instant. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And the other thing is, let's say, slip hazards and other safety hazards. So the idea being that there's health and safety, in this case, safety. As a general, let's say, principle, like I'll give you an example. So a lot of houses have decking at the back, and the decking gets slippery. Now, or another one might be they had a renovation in the 70s, and instead of using spindle staircases, you got the planks with the big gap in the middle, and it's a young family who wants to rent the house. So there's babies crawling around the place, or toddlers, and you can imagine the outcome. If you can't imagine the outcome, by the way, the slip hazard at the back, it's wet, the thing's slimy, they slip, they smash their back. Problem. The baby crawls up the stairs, there's a gap big enough for the baby's head to get through, they slip, and basically they guillotine themselves and have an injury. Danger. What's your general opinion about these kind of safety issues?
Well, if we're talking about decking, usually decking would be in an area of the garden rather than being the entire garden. I have seen terraced houses where, you know, it's usually a yard with a terraced house. If somebody's chosen to deck out that entire yard, then I would be apprehensive. And I would say the bare minimum you need to do is have it professionally jet washed, so it's absolutely free of any moss or anything, any slip hazards. And then you can kind of accept that once a tenant moves in, it's up to them to maintain it as a safe space, you know. And obviously landlords have to get landlord's insurance, and you are covered for these eventualities. But it's a common sense issue, you know. If you're going to buy a property that has a huge area of decking and the tenant would have no choice but to use that, then it depends on your budget, I suppose, but I would always say get rid of it, you know, just get rid of it.
And if you didn't get rid of it, would you add a clause in the contract saying decking maintenance or decking safety maintenance is your responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, the contracts that we use are standard, and I think I've sent you some samples in the past, but I'm happy to do that again.
I've got them. I cherish them. I just want you to know they're beautiful pieces of legal work. Yeah.
There is a dedicated section in there as to what the tenant's responsible for, and it's point after point after point. And the garden is very much in the garden maintenance. It doesn't refer to safety. I don't think it doesn't say anything about the tenant is responsible for their own safety within the property. That's kind of a given. But we can add special clauses in. So if you've done, you know, due diligence, I suppose you could say, when a tenant moves in, you have it jet washed and you make sure that it's not a slip hazard, and it's not going to be for a long time to come, because it takes a while for it to accumulate that slippiness. Then it's not a problem at all to put a clause into the contract. The tenant would sign it to say that maybe, I don't know, you could say every 6 weeks, if that's not unreasonable, or every 2 months, the tenant must jet wash the decking area. I think it's
okay, and the staircase issue, which I see again and again and again and again. Opinion?
Yeah. Again, it's common sense. One thing that I keep being asked, and I've spoken with our regulators, you know, Property Mark, Arla, they're the people that we go to for advice and on the ins and outs of things. One thing that's come up over and over again is glass panels indoors. What is the regulation on that? And from a lettings perspective, there is no legislation. There's no black or white about it. It's a case of if it's according to building regulations. The building regulations now, it's not compliant. You know, if you sent a building inspector in, they would fail it because it's no longer seen as safe to have glass panels indoors. So for a landlord, we always say, you know, just use your common sense. Imagine 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, time passes so quickly, before the electrical installation condition reports came in. It was mandatory. It was law that you had to have a gas safety check done once a year, but there was no regulation about having your electrics checked. However, if a tenant moved into a property where the electrics were unsafe and electrocuted themselves, then the landlord is liable. The landlord could go to prison. So you use your common sense and you have an electrical safety test done before. It wasn't mandatory, but it's good practice and it's common sense to do it. So those days are gone now. It is mandatory to have the electrical safety check done. And I would say things like spindles in staircases and glass panels indoors, treat them as you would have treated the electrical safety issue a few years back. Common
as
sense.
in be proactive and
just be aware of the consequences of the, you know, the risk factor, because yeah, you're not obliged by law to do anything about it, but if something happened, you could go to prison. Yes. So what are you going to do? You know, it just makes sense.
Well, very good. I thank you very much for this, Leila. It's been really interesting chatting with you again. And any final comments or any advice you'd like to give anyone watching?
I would say just take care. Don't rush into buying a property just because you feel like you want to buy an investment property here, and don't just go for the first thing you see because you think, oh yeah, the lettings market is so buoyant that you can let anything. I meet tenants day in and day out who view lots of properties, and they will often, the properties that we market tend to be of a good standard. We don't deal with properties below a certain standard because it's too much, hassle. There's too much maintenance that will come into play. So we'd rather just deal with a certain standard and above. And tenants, they'll view our properties that are of that standard as a minimum, and they will always comment on how it's the best they've seen, because so many landlords are just buying properties, sticking them on the market as they are, and those tenants would rather view 10 properties to find the right one than just jump into any old thing for a lack of options, So don't rush into it. Don't buy a property that is going to need a lot of work thinking that you can just let it as well as you would a nicely presented property, because you won't get the best tenant.
And on that note, thank you very much, Leila.
You're welcome. Speak to you soon.